Thank you, Tom, and thank you everyone for joining me today this lovely Saturday morning. I'm delighted to be a part of the scholars presenting this year. Each of us will make a brief presentation on our research that we've done on Russell and the women in his life and art. At the end of our third speaker's presentation, which is mine, we will have a 10 to 15 minute break for people to get up and stretch their legs. After the break, our two final speakers will present their talks, followed by a 30-minute wrap-up Q&A panel in which all of our speakers will take part. So in the interest in making sure everyone has a timely lunch, we ask you to hold your questions until our panel. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada. Dr. Dippie is one of our foremost scholars of Western history, and throughout his career, Professor Dippie has devoted special emphasis and, I think, affection to C.M. Russell. His countless essays and books on the artist include Looking at Russell, C.M. Russell Word Painter, a book of his illustrated letters, and Remington and Russell, the Sid Richardson Collection. Brian has also edited the indispensable collection of classic essays, Charlie Russell Roundup. I am always honored to hear his thoughts on Russell and other Western artists, especially Russell's rival, Frederic Remington, who animate the canon of American art history. Today, Brian will share his findings on Russell and women and describe how Russell's interactions and depictions of women are woven through his broader philosophy on life and culture in the American West.
I should first off honor every Irish descendant in this room. I found a green sweater, and that'll have to be my contribution, but since I'm Scottish, but nevertheless. I am really delighted to be at the symposium this morning and to have been asked to do the introduction to the catalog on Charles M. Russell and the women in his life and art. It invites two approaches in terms of dealing with a subject that large, biographical and artistic. First, his life. If you look at the biography, it would then focus on the women who were important in Charlie Russell's years, from his mother, Mary, his big sister, Sue, and his first sweethearts to his enduring love affair with the Old West, which he liked to call a wild maiden that he could never forget. Well, of course, Nancy Russell heads the list of influences among women on his life. She was unquestionably the single greatest influence in Charlie Russell's day. And we'll see if the picture comes up. That's the one. Good, all right. Russell's career in art was a sideline until he quit cowboying for good in 1893. He met Nancy, or Mame Cooper, 2 years later, and following their marriage in 1896, she quickly assumed control of the business end of his career. Nancy managed its intricate practicalities, from publicity and exhibition catalogs to travel arrangements, and her version of the art of the deal, and that would be dealing in art. She liked to say, art is a business. We quote her words so often that they lose their impact. Art is a business. Well, she was a whiz at it and he created the art, and that's it. He created the art and Nancy sold it. And this is an image of the two of them, the young couple, making their New York visit the second time. And you can see the art surrounding him, and Nancy, in fact, looking keenly towards the future. Nancy calculated her success by a simple measurement: ever-rising prices and the comforts they brought. Others here will have much more to say about Nancy. I just want to suggest the distance between the starting point and the finishing line. A good starting point photograph: Nancy, Charlie, and his horse Monty, taken in Cascade, where they were still living in May of 1897. When Charlie and Nancy married, they received the usual gifts a couple with no money really need: a silver tea service, a silver berry spoon, a bonbon dish, after-dinner coffee spoons, and so on. Their actual circumstances were more in line with a medical bill that Nancy tucked away in a book. I don't think people have seen this before, and it's probably hard to read from the audience. But Nancy had been hospitalized in Great Falls for a week before their wedding on September 9th in the Ben Roberts home in Cascade. The bill reads, Great Falls, Montana, August 29th, 1896, Miss Millie Mans. Well, that was Nancy's maiden name, Mann, and she was known as Mamie. There probably was some protection of privacy involved in calling her Millie Mans. To Columbus Hospital under the supervision of the Sisters of Charity, 8 days board and attendance at $12. Comes to a total of $13.72 at that time. I guess she ate something or ordered something extra during her stay. And the expenses then for a nurse to Cascade to accompany her back for her wedding, $4. Total owing, $17.72. Then comes the bottom line on this bill, paid. Now remember, the bill is dated August 29th, paid December 23rd, 1896. There's the reality of their finances in the first few months of their marriage. He probably paid the hospital bill with money that he would have received from his relatives in St. Louis for the Christmas gift on their first year of marriage. Well, you can regard that bill of $17.92 and the several months it took to pay it as the starting point in Nancy Russell's quest for success. Here's her abbreviated version of the record that she kept of the race that she ran. This photograph is irresistible to me. That Nancy Russell is a formidable negotiator that you will be dealing with if you want to buy Russell art. Here's her record. $15 for a painting in 1900. A dead man's price, Charlie said. And what he meant by that phrase is, his joke was that an artist never received much payment until they were dead. So he called that $3 or $15 or $3 then a dead man's price. $400 for a picture in New York in 1903. And Nancy said he nearly fainted. $10,000 in Los Angeles for a picture in 1919. He called it a new dead man's price. And then $30,000 in 1926, Charlie said of the check, "I can't read it. Too many zeros, too many figures." And so Nancy crossed the finish line in her pursuit of her end of the Russell career. $30,000 for a mural for a California oilman's library, and plans already underway for a new home to be built in Pasadena. We would have lost Russell to Great Falls if Nancy's planning had not been interrupted by an incident. Charlie Russell died as she was making her plans with a builder in Pasadena. Well, since Nancy's going to receive more attention, I want to give a tip of the hat to a different woman, critically important to Russell's life and certainly to his legacy. Emma Josephine Trigg. Because of her, literally because of her, we're gathered here today. Josephine had a special bond with Nancy. Her father, A.J. Trigg, on the left, proprietor of the Brunswick Bar, was a second father to the budding artist, his real father visiting from St. Louis. C.S. Russell is next from the left. And he had, in effect, provided companionship and quarters for Russell to work when he was still a bachelor, and then subsequently became very good friends with the Triggs when the professional artist was a married man who moved with his young wife to Great Falls in 1897 and became Trigg's neighbors on 4th Avenue North. Josephine, who was 6 years Nancy's senior, was Nancy's closest friend and her social model, as growing fame brought the Russells into Great Falls' social orbit. This picture I don't think is very familiar, but it shows a group of basically high-crust young women, married and unmarried, performing some form of theatrical about 1913 to 1915. And in the foreground, in the lower left, you have Nancy Russell squatting there at the feet of Josephine Trigg. Josephine modeled her. She was her friend and also pushed her, along with her mother, into this social circle. She was also Charlie's soulmate when it came to his art and also to sharing his sense of humor. I love this sequence of photographs. You can see Charlie sitting next to Josephine, and he is clearly cracking a joke if you look at the faces in the picture. The next reaction, you can see Josephine's response and the response of the other people, and then Josephine giving him a jab of the elbow. Oh, Charlie, you can see. She spent most summers at Bullhead Lodge at Lake McDonald, and it's a pretty good image of the Russells sitting with Josephine there. And she often served as Charlie's amanuensis, augmenting his talents with her own. Schooled in art, she was adept at calligraphy. And in her role as the Great Falls Public Library's children's librarian, she shared Charlie's fondness for stories and romance and fantasy. It's Josephine reading to Jack Russell. Sorry he's so blurred in the photo, but it's a pretty good image of Josephine Trigg. Well, her 1915 gift to Charlie was a copy of the book Rip Van Winkle, illustrated by the esteemed children's book illustrator Arthur Rackham. The copy of the book is in the collection of the C.M. Russell Museum. You'll see a book plate of Charlie Russell's. That really wasn't a lifetime plate, but you'll see her inscription on the right-hand page as a Christmas gift, and then a poem that she gave him with the book. They shared this kind of back and forth. It's hard to read there, so let me read it to you. Old Rip, 'twas said, slept 20 years in the Catskills far away, but had Rackham's gnomes put him to sleep, he'd be sleeping to this day. And we, in some of the ferny nooks, at a beautiful lake where we play, and this is an image of Russell's little found art objects showing gnomes that he used to pile in ferny nooks around Bullhead Lodge. So, at a beautiful lake where we play, might have found him sleeping and stolen a look and silently gone on our way. Josephine was Charlie's devoted fan to the very end of his life. This is an image with Nancy Russell, Josephine Trigg's mother, Margaret, Josephine, and Joe de Jong's mother, and they are all at Bullhead Lodge in August 1926, gathered around Charlie just months before his death. She remained, Nancy's closest confidant following his death, and kept the Russell flame burning after Nancy too passed on in 1940. Thank goodness Josephine did. Because of her devotion to his memory, she is responsible for turning a Russell Memorial, his home and his studio, into the splendid museum we all enjoy in Great Falls today. So if we turn from this influence and the women in his life, just briefly to his art. The wellspring of Charlie Russell's art is easily identified. He recalled with yearning the West of his youth and brought it back to life with the boring parts left out. In his paintings, Russell light bathes buttes and mountains and rivers in a golden glow that illuminates a vast land occupied for Russell by larger-than-life people. Speaking of liars, he wrote in 1917, the Old West could put in its claim for more of them than any other land under the sun. The mountains and plains seem to stimulate man's imagination. A man in the States might have been a liar in a small way, but when he comes west, he soon takes lessons from the prairies, where ranges 100 miles away seem within touching distance. Streams run uphill, and nature appears to lie some herself. Charlie's choice of words is revealing. Western liars might be men prone to exaggerate, but they were Ma Nature's legitimate offspring. For Charlie Russell, the Old West would always be a magic land, and his art would gift it to the world. By 1887, in the wake of the publicity surrounding his little sketch, a poignant sketch, Waiting for a Chinook, the Montana press dubbed Charlie Russell the cowboy artist. His picture was circulated through photographs, but newspapers back then were rarely illustrated. And in fact, Waiting for a Chinook for all of its fame was never actually reproduced in any publication until 1904. Before then, the work was principally known through descriptions. They were sufficient to create a local sensation, while the cowboy artist continued to wrangle horses and cattle for a living for 6 more years, minus a hiatus visiting in Alberta in 1888. It turned out that visiting many of the natives in southern Alberta was part of his summer excursion there. The pagans, the Blackfeet, the Bloods, the Sarcees, and thereafter, after 1888, Indians would always figure prominently in Russell's work. The earliest reproductions of Russell art in publications are very instructive in that regard. They broadcast his cowboy artist credentials and established his reputation outside Montana while he was still riding the range. 1887, first Russell reproduction. Problem seeing it. That's it, isn't it? A black and white print published out of Chicago with the really imaginative title, A Copy of C.M. Russell's Last Painting, with cowboy artist prominently stuck in the caption. Features 7 scenes of cowboy life. In 1889, Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper reproduced another cowboy collage redrawn by J.H. Smith, Ranch Life in the Northwest. But Russell Indians were also featured in early reproductions. Harper's Weekly on May 12, 1888, published a cowboy and Indian subject caught in the act. Notice that while the purely cowboy pictures that I showed show only men, this stark and haunting winter scene shows an Indian family, men, women, and children. The same year, 1888, the Northwest, a magazine out of Minnesota, published 3 Russell paintings, all redrawn for reproduction. 2 were cowboy subjects. First attempt at roping, and this was published in July of 1888. And then right at the beginning of the next year, on a Montana cattle ranch, roping a steer, done in January 1889. But the first painting reproduced in Northwest in the March 1888 issue featured Indian women, Crow Indians on the move, and it's a pen etching by Larpenteur after a Russell painting. All 3 that I've just shown are redrawn by artists from the original paintings. The first one then is the one that we have up there, and you might notice then that no women appear in any Russell cowboy subject reproduced in the 1880s or the 1890s until the decade came to a close. even when he illustrated a book in 1895 by a woman, Mrs. Nat Collins, with the enticing title, The Cattle Queen of Montana, there's not a woman in the 3 illustrations. Yet Indian women, from the outset, are part of Russell's West. Let's look at that Harper's Weekly picture again. Caught in the act. Buffalo skulls figure in all of those early Russell paintings. He hadn't yet incorporated the skull fully into his signature. They were an element usually tucked in the left corner of his artwork as a full-blown buffalo skull. The press called the buffalo skull early on Russell's trademark. But here the skull takes on the full symbolic weight of his vision. If you look at the detail there, it says everything we need to know about the desperate plight confronting a native people dependent on buffalo for sustenance and reduced to killing the white man's cattle, the white man's buffalo, a cow and a calf, in order to survive. The buffalo skull perfectly encapsulates the illustration's meaning and expresses Russell's lifelong master theme, the West that is past. Indian women fit in. White women did not. The very first reproduction of a Russell subject that included a white woman appeared in 1899 in 2 books, Pen Sketches and Rhymes from a Roundup Camp. Note that this year, 1899, was 3 years after Russell had married. In Pen Sketches, we have Range Rider's Conquest. Now, this was the second last plate in the book of plates showing Russell as a pen and ink artist, and it was followed by an allegorical drawing, the last buffalo. The last of his race. It shows a white woman on a bicycle. She looks a lot like Josephine Trigg to me, riding past a despondent old man who's gazing at a buffalo skull. That Indian and that skull symbolize a lost world and why it was lost. Winning at courtship, it turned out, meant losing as well. Settling down, domesticating, progress. You can see the stack in the distance spewing, the smoke in the sky, and in the smoke, the image of a phantom buffalo hunt, of a world that used to be. So when we look at Range Rider's Conquest, we have to realize it's the conquest of the conqueror. The winning at courtship meant waving the old days farewell. In 1899, Russell also illustrated a book of verse by his old rangeland friend, Wallace Coburn, the cowboy poet, as he was called. So Russell and Coburn, about 1905. Rhymes from a Roundup Camp includes a drawing of cowboys, not unlike Russell, if you look at the one facing you, and Coburn attending a dance. The title below the plate was, "And with a sort of stately bow, he turned his back on Sim." That's Bill Riley turning his back on his best friend, Parson Sim, and bowing to a gal named Val for Valentine. Well, here's what the poem reads. They chummed as boys together, learned to shoot and ride, worked for the same cow outfits, and grew up side by side. Well, cowboy poet maybe, doggerel writer definitely, right? Well, now they're rivals for Valentine's heart, and a gunfight follows and both men are killed. Buried, quote, on a sunny hill, they're together again, sleeping side by side. And Val, she never married, but sometimes comes to weep and wet the flowers with her tears, where both her lovers sleep. There's a lesson here, of course. Women had fatal charms. Valentine has killed something beautiful, not just a friendship, but a way of life. Just as civilization has killed Russell's first sweetheart, the Wild West of his youth. Rhymes from roundup camps, frontispiece says it all, and I leave you a second to sort of run your eye over this allegorical drawing. Wild West, Dame Progress proudly stands. If you look at the elements of it, women weren't excluded from Russell's Old West. In the wake of the Buffalo Runners is ample proof that they were not excluded. White women were excluded. That is in the wake of the Buffalo Runners, right? Yeah. I have great eyesight, so I have to be sure. It is. White women weren't there. For him, they stood for the future and not the past, and thus carried the burden of transformative change. Take a look at this detail from Dame Progress. And you can see the woman photographing. You can see Dame Progress's haughty figure. And you can see the man there. I think he's a man with a bicycle. They represented the end of a way of life, the life that his art celebrated with unabashed nostalgia. Right below Dame Progress's feet is a coffin, draped with a buffalo hide and a buffalo skull before it. And in fact, you can see on the hide the words Old West, and I think it says loved by all who knew her. The Old West is being vanquished by progress. Charlie Russell, I think you still have much to teach us through your art and your life and the intersection of the two of them. And I can't resist showing you this Dame Progress and a detail of Nancy in the studio. Now, I have one other thing and then I'm finished, but I wanted you to know that I'm aware of the fact that there is a cowboy in that allegorical drawing of Progress, and that cowboy resembles very much a pose that Russell took, and it's in the museum right at the front door, in the same day that Nancy was photographed with her hand on the hip. This image, here we go, of Charlie Russell. And there's the cowboy at the Old West funeral. His stance and Russell's stance, in fact, are matched. But it's this image I want to leave you with of Nancy and Dame Progress. The forthcoming exhibition and the beautiful catalog accompanying it will present issues like these that I've raised through the perceptive curation of the exhibition and the essays of its contributors, Joan and Emily, Jennifer and Tom. So it's time you heard from the real brains behind Charles M. Russell and the women in his life and art. Thanks.
So that'll be a hard act to follow, but I know Joan will be up to it. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Troccoli, who is serving as our guest curator of our exhibition, Charles M. Russell, The Women in His Life and Art. She is also editor of the forthcoming catalog of the show. And Joan has served as both curator and director of the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and she is the founding director of the Petrie Institute of Western American Art at the Denver Art Museum. Her recent projects include co-curating the 2013 exhibition George Catlin, American Indian Portraits for the National Portrait Gallery in London. Before that, she curated the retrospective of the paintings and bronzings of C.M. Russell at the Denver Art Museum and edited the accompanying catalog, The Masterworks of C.M. Russell. She is currently completing a comprehensive catalog of the George Catlin collection at the Gilcrease Museum to be published by the University of Oklahoma Press, hopefully soon, she says. So Joan has been a great mentor to me in this project on Russell, and I am indebted and grateful to her for all her shepherding and support throughout the process. Her presentation today is an overview of the women who animated Russell's waking life and how they intertwined with those who dominated the dreamscapes and nostalgic history of his canvases. So.
Good morning. Let me adjust this a little bit. Right. It's great to be here. I love Great Falls. I love this museum, and this has been an incredible experience working on this show with all of our co-workers. And we're so excited that, about 2 months from tomorrow, actually, the show will open here at the C.M. Russell Museum. I would like to begin this morning with a few words about the genesis of the exhibition. I'm beginning with a familiar face, actually two familiar faces, Fred and Ginger Renner, sort of the godparents of Russell scholarship, and then one of Ginger after Fred passed away. Ginger was a scholar and an expert on Russell, as well as a dealer in his work. And often dealers get the best information, or at least some of it. She made her most significant contribution to Russell studies in 1984 when she published an article entitled Charlie Russell and the Ladies in His Life in Montana Magazine. On the first page of her article, Ginger Renner noted that most of Russell's admirers, most of his fans, identified him with the depiction of men in action. And here is one of those great images, In Without Knocking, which shows some cowboys sort of at leisure, we might say. Ginger explained this fact for this overwhelming identification of Russell and men with the fact that the great majority of reproductions of his work, which were circulated in calendars, postcards, illustrations to books and magazine articles, as well as individual prints, the great majority of these showed men in dramatic and sometimes violent situations, such as the one you see here. There's equal opportunity, another of those exciting pictures. For most people, Russell's trademark was action. And his subjects, whether they were cowboys, Indians, bandits, and trappers, even gold miners, were almost exclusively male. In the popular mind in the mid-1980s, Russell's West was viewed as a rambunctious, cinematic, often perilous masculine environment that was literally no place for a lady. But all that started to change when Ginger published her article and made sort of an unconventional argument that Russell had made more paintings and sculptures and other works depicting women than any other comparable artist of the American West. For example, Frederick Remington, who almost never depicted women. Ginger did a little counting up, and she discovered, and I quote, over 300 oils, watercolors, drawings, and sculptural models by Russell in which women were the primary subject. To give them center stage, just to include them was unusual. To give them center stage quite a bit was unheard of. No one's really followed up on Ginger's seminal article until now with this very wonderful exhibition and the book that's being published to go with it. This is our opportunity to build on Ginger's contribution with the benefit of all the scholarship that's taken place in the last 35 years since she published Charlie Russell and the Ladies in His Life. I'm kind of, in the catalog, I'm sort of the overview provider, so I'm just very briefly going to talk about the kinds of topics that we treat there and also give you some previews of what's going to be in the show. Lucy Bennett Russell, whom Ginger acknowledged, Lucy Bennett Russell was Charlie Russell's grandmother. Her biography and the stories that she told based upon it had a major impact on the artist that Russell became. Lucy Bennett Russell, at the time of his birth, Charlie's birth in 1864, was kind of the CEO of the family business, which was a plantation and mining operation called Oak Hill that had been founded in 1811 by her husband, James Russell. When James Russell died in 1850, Lucy literally took over the family business, and she ran it very successfully until 1869, when Charlie Russell's father, also named Charles Russell, took over the reins of the corporation and moved to Oak Hill, to the plantation house, with his young family. At that time, Charlie Russell was just 5 years old. Lucy Bennett Russell was born in a legendary Western family. And we have to remember that St. Louis around 1800 had maybe 1,000 people living there. So at the time that her father came in 1805, it was barely, it was an exaggeration to call it a city. It was also a newly American city. Silas Bennett Jr., Lucy's father, moved to St. Louis in 1806, almost simultaneously with the return of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark from their famous expedition to the Pacific. Silas Bennett was a very high-ranking federal official whose job it was to oversee the survey of the Louisiana Purchase, which was kind of a big job, especially given the fact that nobody actually really quite knew where it began and ended. Well, it ended somewhere further west. Lucy almost certainly knew William Clark, who was a major official in St. Louis himself until he died in the 1830s. And I'm sure she also came into contact with many of the fur trade executives who then dominated the St. Louis economy. So when we look at a picture like this great one in the Montana State Capitol, we have to remember that Charlie Russell felt a family connection to Lewis and Clark, as he did with many of the other subjects that he portrayed in his career. This is probably hard to see. On the left is a bird's eye view of Oak Hill and the neighborhood around it. If I had a pointer, I guess I do, but I'm afraid to use it. There were orchards, there were mines, there was a little factory that made fireproof bricks. It's now, if you know St. Louis at all, it's now, it was literally across the street from the great Missouri Botanic Gardens. She also had some interesting siblings. This is William Bennett, her brother, slightly younger. I don't know how I succeeded in sort of giving him this interesting tattoo. I have never been able to get it out of there. But anyway, among her siblings were two towering figures of the fur trade, William Bent and Charles Bent. They founded Bent's Fort, very famous outpost on the Santa Fe Trail, which they also helped to pioneer in the 1820s. Bent's Fort, located in what's now the state of Colorado, was a leading depot in the buffalo robe trade, which was sort of the end point of the American fur trade. One of their closest associates was Kit Carson, who was also a trapper at the beginning of his illustrious career. And he too would become a hero and a favorite subject of Charlie Russell's. And he was also distantly related to Charlie Russell. Kit Carson, his second wife, was the sister of Charlie's great-uncle Charles Bent's wife, so they were sort of distantly related. Again, a connection for Charlie Russell, provided by Lucy. Lucy Russell died when Charlie was only 7 years old, but she was a great storyteller. And Russell absorbed a lot of what he knew about the West, and certainly he absorbed a lot of literature by listening to other people either tell a story or read a book. Her stories of the Old West, which she loved to tell, stuck with Russell throughout his career. Charlie Russell's paternal forebears, the Bents, had supplied him with colorful subject matter, great material. His mother's relatives contributed the creative DNA that would enable Russell to bring those subjects to gilded, romanticized life. Charlie's mother, Mary Elizabeth Mead Russell, was the daughter of a prominent St. Louis jeweler and silversmith who was also a supplier of all the gaudy trinkets which formed such a huge part of the store of fur traders who traded them to Indians. So she too had this fur trade connection, as did almost everybody that lived in St. Louis in the first parts of the 19th century. Mary Mead Russell was raised in a very prosperous household, and as a daughter of a leading family, she probably received art lessons as a young girl. She continued to paint as an amateur and exhibit her work even after her marriage to Charlie Russell's father in 1858. And she was very encouraging of her children's creative pursuits. And she must have been particularly thrilled with Charlie, because from a very young age, he was making some pretty extraordinary art. I also think that his talent, which found such great expression in his childhood, kind of made it easier for Charlie Russell to get away with some of the naughty stuff that he did. I think his parents were very tolerant of his skipping school and pulling practical jokes, partly because he was such a wonderful young artist. Now, this is the youngest of the women who played decisive roles in Russell's life. His wife, Nancy, who, as Brian has explained, served as Russell's business manager, his dealer, his promoter. She was kind of a networker, and she also enforced a productive work schedule, without which Russell would not have been nearly as prolific as he was. That's all I'm going to say about Nancy as a person, because you already have learned a lot about Nancy from Brian, and you will learn more from our other speakers. This is the soft side of Nancy, sort of sweet and nice. But now I really want to turn to talking about the women in Russell's art. And Nancy was one of them, although she rarely appears as herself. This is an exception, although I don't know, it is meant to be a portrait of Nancy. It's a pair of very famous drawings from 1896, the year that Troccoli married Nancy. One is called, well, As I Was, the other, it's kind of a before and after view of Charlie's Spartan bachelor lifestyle before marriage and his totally sort of, it's like he returns to his roots. He goes back to being a domesticated young person who's prosperous once he is hooked up with Nancy Russell. Now, this before and after image, which seems very personal and is very personal, is like many of Russell's depictions of women, it does express a very familiar stereotype of Western white women. And Brian has mentioned that there is this sort of dichotomy in Russell's art between white women of his own time and Indian women, really of the past. And we'll talk about that in a second. But I have discovered in working on this show that Russell's pictures of white women and of Indian women embody some of the most common conceptions of women's role in the Old West. And the premier role for a white woman was that of a gentle tamer. A gentle tamer is the sort of genteel and sensitive white woman who moves to the frontier once pioneering men, bold pioneering men, have finished the dirty and dangerous work of conquering that frontier. The job of the gentle tamer was to introduce good manners, better grammar, higher moral standards, and some semblance of cultural life to the raw frontier. She was behind the building of schools, libraries, musical societies, hospitals, churches, everything that makes civilization, kind of brings the West within the embrace of civilization. And the gentle tamer was civilization's sort of advanced agent. Russell often approached the collision, and that's what we see here, the collision of modern women and uncouth Western men, which is the way he fancied himself, with humor, as he does in As I Was and As I Am Now. But his take on the gentle tamer could also be pretty hostile. Just to refresh our knowledge of Russell, let's remember that his great theme, the theme that dominated sort of the overarching theme of all of his great work, was something called The West That Has Passed. And here's you can see a catalog of a show he had in London in 1914. The West That Has Passed was a fabulous and pretty much mythical kingdom that began to coalesce around 1750. By this time, Plains Indians had fully absorbed horses, which had been introduced to North America by the Spanish in the early 16th century, fully incorporated horses into their culture and economy. They also enjoyed the benefits of trade goods such as metal pots and sharp knives. All of these things they had from Europeans, but they had not yet been confronted with huge waves of European settlement. Russell's trappers and cowboys, who arrived much later on the scene, obviously than Plains Indians since they started out there, they shared with these heroes of Russell an independent, rustic way of life that was intimately bound up with nature and animals. The West that has passed was trampled out of existence when agricultural settlers and civic boosters flooded the Great Plains after the Civil War. To Charlie Russell, a homesteading woman, such as this one and her family, was the personification of the forces that obliterated the West that has passed. She was a gentle tamer, but a gentle tamer of the worst sort. You could actually detect Russell's distaste for such women, as well as their men, in his images of pioneering families, such as Last Chance or Bust. And hopefully you can see well enough to see that everybody in this picture is kind of a zombie. They are headed for what's now called Helena, Montana, but at the time was Last Chance Gulch, which was a gold rush site. And they're heading there, but I think they're really not so much to pan for gold as to establish a homestead. These people could not be more different than the Indian warriors, the cowboys, and even gold miners at Last Chance Gulch, who were all subjects of Charlie, than we can imagine. However, not all white women in the West were bad. Charlie made an exception for women who were associated with ranching or for women that he knew himself. They were all right in his book. Going to a Christmas ranch party in the 1880s depicts the sort of event that would have been part of Russell's life in that decade when he was still a very young man working on the range. He gave one of these figures the features of Josephine Trigg. She's the figure in red, even though he didn't meet her until the 1890s. Trigg, as Brian has very well explained, was a librarian, and thus could not have been more strongly associated with the feminine forces of frontier civilization. But in a mark of his respect and affection, and without a trace of irony, Charlie puts Trigg in situations in which she is an admirable, boisterous young woman who can ride a galloping horse and otherwise add a little note of activity to the Old West. As Brian pointed out, white women virtually disappear from Russell's major paintings and watercolors after 1900. There's a kind of dividing line. And, oops. This, as you can see, is from 1908, but it's a rarity in Russell's art after 1900. It's also quite small. This is not a major painting. White women disappear from Russell's major art, but they continue to appear in his lesser works, including illustrations for books and especially illustrated letters. And I'm glad we have a nice selection of illustrated letters in this show because they speak volumes about Russell's attitudes toward white women. They permitted him to register his bafflement with the ways of modern women. For example, in this letter called Bathing Suits Are Truthful, which shows Charlie on the beach in his bathing costume, and also some women who were, this is from 1920, so by then women actually wore swimsuits that didn't come down to their knees. This sort of thing let Russell register his disapproval with the mores of the modern woman. And he did many in which women don't have much on, and he could not, for the life of him, figure out why they wore such skimpy clothing. Because if they were trying to snare a husband, he thought it would be much smarter to project some uncertainty about what would be discovered on the wedding night. You'll see, I love Charlie's little, oops, I don't know why I'm painting. And here's another somewhat hilarious letter from the Montana Historical Society. In the ideal realm of the West that is past, there was no place for women of his own time, just as modern America seemed not to have a place for Charlie Russell. And in this image, which I hope you can see, there's this sort of outrageous time warp in which Russell finds himself. He is still the old-time cowpoke Charlie Russell, but he's stumbled upon a female nature lover of the mid-1920s, perhaps in Glacier National Park. As white women migrated out of Russell's paintings, Native women more than took their place. In fact, Indian women always outnumber white women in Russell's significant works throughout his entire career. Early on, Russell depicted Indian women as sexually alluring, as in his series of paintings of a totally fictional young Indian woman who was named Kioma. Kind of a come hither thing. And in one-off works like this is called Indian Maid at the Stockade. And this is unique in the remarkable directness with which a young Native woman who stands within or without it, the stockade of a trading post kind of makes her appeal to the viewer. She flaunts her charms, and she would have been flaunting them to the exclusively male employees, mostly white, of the fur trade establishment where she stands, in a very aggressive way. Once Nancy comes into the picture, Russell sort of gets away from these kinds of subjects. So he makes a transition, working in more Indian women to his major works, and also painting them in a very idealized way. The fetching young lady that we see in the chaperone here is ostensibly filling up her jug at a little water course, is still sexy, but their sexuality is presented by Russell in sort of a closed society, as intimately tethered to a very traditional Native American life cycle, and thus not, crossing any boundaries. Now, one of the most interesting things about Russell's Indian women are the two contrasting ways in which he represents them. If our only source of information about Indian women in the 19th century was Charlie Russell, we would believe that Plains Indians women were really almost exclusively of two types. They were either intensely desirable young beauties, such as this young lady, or withered, repellent old crones. And the chaperone of the title plays the, I love the Indian guy wanting to come over and say hi, but this horrible, scary witch stands between him and his intended. Now, Brian, in his studies of Russell, has observed that Russell's division of Indian women into two extreme groups, of youth and of age, was probably due, in large part, to Russell's personal observation in Montana in the 1880s and early 1890s. When he was a bachelor in his late teens and early 20s, the charms of young Indian women would undoubtedly have appealed very strongly to Charlie Russell. And at that point in his life, when he's absorbing his impressions for his art, older Indian women probably, like older women in general, probably appeared to be very old. And I have tested this theory by finding some old pictures of Tom Brokaw, circa 1980, and remarking to myself, he looks so young. But then remembering that back in the 1980s, when I was young, he looked to be very, very old. So it's just that sort of difference. However, Russell's conception of Indian women as either young and attractive or repulsive and old was also rooted in a stereotype of literature and art that dated back hundreds of years, almost to the first moment that Europeans made contact with Native Americans. Beautiful young Indian women who befriended and helped explorers and colonists. And the great model was Pocahontas, who saved John Smith and helped preserve Jamestown in Virginia. Women like that were equated with purity and aristocracy. They were really Indian princesses. They were European royalty. And the Europeans' eyes are comparable to that. All other Indian women, the vast majority, were derided as ugly, deceitful, and promiscuous by Europeans who were moving in, and probably made it easier for the Europeans to justify taking their land. In Russell's, oops, wrong button. In Russell's West That Is Past, the young maiden, after this sort of courtship period, enters into marriage, whereupon she becomes a devoted wife who caters to every need and whim of her husband. She raises the children, tends the garden, cooks, makes food, and actually, food and clothing, which is a list of responsibilities that's quite comparable to those of white women in the 19th century. Not so much difference there. But Indian women also butchered, packed, and hauled home hundreds of pounds of meat from the hunting grounds. They skinned bison, tanned their hides, thus providing a major source of cash income or trade income for Plains tribes. And they constructed and transported teepees and every other piece of domestic paraphernalia. If Indian women aged prematurely, there was good reason for it. But in presenting native married life, Russell relied a good deal on the findings of earlier 19th century anthropologists. We have to remember that when Russell came west, the West That Is Past was already pretty much past. All it took was that big blizzard of 1887 to put an end to the cowboy, the last vestige of the West that is past. Most anthropologists who wrote about Indian women noted very disapprovingly that their husbands exploited and mistreated their wives. Not Charlie Russell, though, even though he took the details from other students of Indians, he consistently presented native domestic life in a positive, glowing light, as we see here. In Victorian America, which was Charlie Russell's America, motherhood was a woman's highest calling. And Russell, who himself was the son of a close-knit family with a mother whom he loved dearly, probably subscribed to that doctrine, at least in the abstract. In Russell's art, Indian mothers of babies and toddlers actually retain their maidenly charms, although they start to become more serious because they're so focused on raising their children. The epitome of Native American motherhood is Sacagawea, who you see on the right side. I think she's with Clark in a canoe, and they're making contact with some Northwest Coast Indians. Sacagawea joined Lewis and Clark's expedition in 1805 and 06. She lived in a Hidatsa village on the upper Missouri, and she provided help for them for the portion of their trip that went to the Pacific in 1805 and then came back to the Hidatsa village where she was dropped off in 1806. While the explorers were in their winter quarters near this village, Sacagawea gave birth to a son. And Russell frequently included the baby tucked in his cradle board in his pictures of the expedition. And in fact, there you see the cradle board on Sacagawea's back in Russell's design for a monumental sculpture, something that didn't actually, was not cast until after his death. And she's got her little guy on her shoulders. Sacagawea's knowledge of Western geography and Indian languages, not to mention her remarkable willingness to pitch in with all the strength of any man on the expedition, were not her only contributions. In fact, there are historians who say that as the only woman to accompany the explorers, and quite visibly a native woman and a woman who was also a mother, Sacagawea probably should be credited with nothing less than ensuring the expedition's survival. Indian men, parties of Indian men, who in Charlie's pictures of the expedition. Often there are Indian men looking down on the expedition paddling by on the Missouri. Indian men who might have normally been inclined to attack an alien party of white males trespassing in their territory may well have refrained from doing so when they saw Sacagawea, because they reasoned that the intentions of any group that included a native mother and her newborn child must be peaceful. We've heard that Sacagawea was a Shoshone who was kidnapped, and here is the miraculous picture of Sacagawea's reunion with her family by some kind of miracle in the Lemhi Valley. The explorers were looking for horses and for some help in crossing the Rocky Mountains when they literally bumped into a band of Sacagawea's Shoshone relatives, including her brother, who was actually a chief. And thanks to her presence and belonging to the expedition, they got what they needed. Now, this painting is kind of interesting in that Sacagawea, who is shown embracing a cousin, is in the back of the middle ground. She's not the foremost figure, who of course is William Clark. But Russell, who was just a narrative and compositional genius, set this up so that Clark himself, as well as almost all the other figures in the composition, either gesture toward or look at Sacagawea, and they lead our eye to this subtle but very touching embrace of Sacagawea with her family. Now, you should also note in this picture, next to Toussaint Charbonneau, who was Sacagawea's husband, whom no one liked, but next to him in the back there is one of those old crones who just kind of turn up like a very discordant note in a lot of Russell's paintings. And when you come to see the show, it's almost kind of a game to find the old crone. Okay. In counting up depictions of women by Charles M. Russell, Ginger Renner determined that his second favorite subject overall was Indian women transporting their children and households across the plains. The Indian buffalo hunt was his favorite subject, but Indian women moving camp came in second. Moving camp, we have a nice selection of these pictures in the show. Moving camp was an arduous business, and Russell fully recognized that in getting the village from place to place without the assistance of men, women made a contribution to community welfare that was fully as heroic as any effort of their husbands in hunting or war. Almost always folded in to these trailing pictures, as I like to call them, and almost always folded in to an Indian woman's agenda was her devotion to the needs of her children. Here they've brought the caravan to a halt to give a drink to a baby. And in this wonderful little picture, you can see this, there's this plump little round-faced baby in his cradle board peeking over the side of his mother's horse to see the foal who is nursing his mother's horse. As a genre painter, Russell had a supreme asset, which was his ability to pick out and include these little human incidents that brought paintings to life. Now, I need to remind you again that for all their engrossing ethnographic detail, all of Russell's wonderful pictures of Sacagawea and the other women whom he situated in his West that is past were to a very great extent products of his imagination, not of his observation. The convincing world that Russell presented in paintings like this great one from 1900, Indian Hunter's Return, was very long gone, if indeed it had ever existed, and it probably didn't. Russell never saw a village like this one. He cobbled this together from his observation of human nature and all those details he got from earlier artists who did visit villages like this, such as George Catlin. Now, I want to just draw your attention to the left, sort of lower left, where you see a group of Indian women, always women's job, butchering a buffalo, which their hunter husbands have brought in to feed the community during what was undoubtedly a frigid Montana winter. Now to see a picture you've already seen, caught in the act. What's interesting about Russell's early work in Montana and his early depictions of Indian women there was that it was far more faithful to the real world of Northern Plains women as he observed it. This was really Russell's world, this sad picture of Indian women butchering a stolen steer. Looks like it's flop, but that's okay. There's that sort of contrast between the wonderful, warm village, all aflutter in Indian Hunter's Return, and then this very grim image. As the article that accompanied this picture when it was published in Harper's Weekly noted, Russell had caught the mournful aspect of a winter scene in Montana. Anyone acquainted with frontier life will at once appreciate the truthfulness of this picture. But Russell, of course, lost interest in portraying this sort of harsh condition and the contemporary Indian women he actually knew, just as he lost interest in painting contemporary white women. He was far more comfortable in presenting them as fantasy. His pictures of the Indian women of his own time migrated, as did white women of his own time, into Russell's lesser works, drawings and illustrations. But they never really lose their edge. This wonderful drawing from 1900, Mothers Under the Skin, does sort of a common Russell, it uses a common Russell technique of juxtaposing two opposites. There's the mother with the little baby and lapdog lounging on her front lawn, which we have to assume was in Great Falls, while an Indian woman, also with a baby and a scruffier dog, passes by on the sidewalk. She's going to the railroad station in Great Falls to sell what looks like a hat rack that's made out of antlers. So there's this painful juxtaposition of these two women. One who really, this was her land, going by the much luckier and more prosperous woman who, in Russell's mind, stands for the people who took it. That's kind of awful. I'll close today with Miss Montana, a watercolor that Russell made in 1913. It's one of the very few positive predictions of depictions of a white woman of Russell's own time by Russell. She is the personification of the state of Montana, and she's shown pleading with Uncle Sam, wearing his normal suit, to provide some land for a reservation for a homeless band of Indians who had been wandering around Montana for years. She's pleading the case of the two Indians and sort of the shadow land behind them who've been displaced by real estate development, which is symbolized by the central figure of a man whom Russell calls the land hog. And as I said, this was drawn as a political cartoon in that campaign to create a reservation for Indians who had lost their homes. I think also we should think of Miss Montana, this sharply dressed young woman, as kind of a stand-in for Charlie Russell himself. His job, or his conception of his purpose in painting so many great pictures of this wonderful West that has passed, was as a form of argument for better treatment for the Indians of his own time. It's all part of a positive image of the American Indian and his hope for how they could be accommodated. Now, because we're short on time, that was actually the end. We are going to move on, though, to my introduction of Emily, who's our second speaker. I'm going to be brief, but it has been wonderful to work with Emily on curating this exhibition. We are very close buddies by email and by phone as we've worked together to assemble the show and its catalog with the help of all our speakers today and the fabulous staff of the C.M. Russell Museum. We have shared and shared alike in the burdens of organizing the show, but Emily really deserves much more credit because she did the most demanding, nitpicky stuff, and she got it all done while still working full-time as a curator, the curator of the Russell Museum. One of these great pleasures has been my development of a friendship with Emily. She received her bachelor's at the University of Florida and her master's degree in art history from Indiana University in shockingly recent times. She has extensive art museum experience, even though she's so young. And about a year ago, she was promoted from assistant curator to full curator here. And although no one asked my advice about whether she should be promoted, I was totally happy when she moved up on the chain. She is an inventive, creative, and most of all, smart curator, a wonderful art historian, and someone who has brought a fresh point of view to the show. And without further ado, Emily Wilson will speak.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Joan? I didn't touch the input. They may have to load it. Oh, great. So my presentation today, I thought I'd begin with what are perhaps two of my favorite images of Russell, dressed in drag at his home in Cascade and Bullhead Lodge. I should say that he is not the first artist I've come across that took liberties with costume play. The Ashcan artists, including Everett Shinn and John Sloan, did so too, and I suspect it was not unusual to play around with gender roles. So just in case you thought he was a little wacky, Russell is in good company with other artists in doing so. So both pictures here are reflective of Russell's attitude of play. The physical act of role-playing is as intimately connected to the body as it is with the imagination. Here we see Russell as the jester, the entertainer, and a man so intimately comfortable with himself that he has no issues inhabiting the clothes, persona, or role of another. At heart, Russell is a performer. As his cousin Fergus Mead once described, quote, "Charlie was a bit of a grandstander," or to put it more gently, that he had a good deal of the theatrical in him. He certainly insisted in dressing the part whenever he was in the East, with his high-heeled boots, his big Stetson, and his sash, all of which was good business but not very hard for Charlie to do, unquote. And we see this with all of his personalities. Kid Russell, the cowboy artist, Rawhide Rollins, the old-time raconteur, and Awakasi, the white Indian. So while he plied his reputation as a self-taught artist, Russell was by no means an isolated savant. Like many of his professional peers, he kept himself informed as to the artistic movements, conventional styles, and techniques of his day through reading, travel, visual study, and communication with other artists. This diverse environment shaped his portrayals of women, bringing elements of the mythic, the exotic, and the fictional into his art. So here is a great posed photo of one of Nancy's friends from Cascade, Nell Johnson Gorham, with Russell's guitar, which we have in the collection. The photo is a great reference to show his close associations and friendships with women throughout his life. And in fact, Russell sometimes used his friends as live models. Who knows, maybe she was the inspiration for Russell's My Valentine, which shows a girl playing a bowlback mandolin and was painted for Leela Roberts, another of Russell and Nancy's friends, to raise funds at a church social in Cascade. You see here the neoclassical references that Russell brings out. The addition of putti figures and the mandolin, along with what could be the personification of spring. The mandolin gained considerable popularity with amateur musicians in the 1890s, along with the guitar and the banjo, both of which were owned and played by Russell. And the mandolin was also a prominent motif that was referenced in an Aesop fable, The Ant and the Grasshopper. This fable juxtaposed the virtues of hard work with the consequences of idle pleasures. So it was popularly depicted, this fable, by artists in the late 19th century, such as French academicians Leon Basile Perrault and Edward Bisson, and the American Frederick Arthur Bridgman. And these works reminded me a bit of My Valentine. Another popular neoclassical motif for artists, writers, and poets in the 19th century were Greek goddesses, among them Venus and Psyche. Psyche was the wife of Cupid, who himself was the son of Venus. Psyche's name in ancient Greek translates as butterfly and refers to the human soul. Thus in art, Psyche is commonly represented with butterfly wings to convey the lightness of the soul, and you can see that in Wood Nymph. She's sporting a beautiful pair and has a butterfly in the picture. So the artist's early inspirations deriving from mythological figures and classical themes proved an easy transition into the realm of fantasy, where gnomes, nymphs, and fictional characters sprung to life in later works. Here we see two of Russell's plaster models of nymphs, one which he gave to his neighbor Josephine Trigg in 1920, and the other, which served as a wax candle holder, remained in Nancy's possession. These flowing Beaux Arts-inspired sculptures share similarities to the elaborately illustrated works of Arthur Rackham, who Brian Dippie described, whose depictions of fairies and gnomes gained popularity through the distribution of these deluxe illustrated volumes, which you can see some pages on the right, by prominent authors such as Washington Irving, and that's a depiction of the fairies and gnomes in the Rip Van Winkle that Josephine Trigg had gifted to Russell for Christmas. So moving back into the mythological, we can derive perhaps another source of Russell's artistic inspirations in his own backyard, the Mint Bar and Saloon in Great Falls, which opened in 1898. Looking at this interior photograph from the same year, you can see a replica of the statue Venus with the Apple by Danish artist Bertal Thorvaldsen in the middle of the bar, and a wonderful modesty curtain surrounding it, along with what appears to be a Russell painting hanging above it of a buffalo hunt, which might be buffalo hunt number 22, painted in 1898, but it may not as well. The visual evidence is kind of unclear. But this fun juxtaposition of male virility and feminine charm is what historian Elliot West referred to as Victorian macho, and it was a popular decoration scheme in Western bars, which you can still see today. I just think the pairing of the two is quite interesting. This whole theme of beauty and death intertwined, if you think of the buffalo hunt, romantic and nostalgic and yet killing. And then Venus, she's holding the apple, which was the judgment of Paris, and the forewarning of the Greek and the Trojan War. So in the 19th century, academic fine arts training frequently included instruction in drawing from the antique, a practice which in casts of classical sculptures were arranged in the classroom for students to draw from. Russell's brief and only stint in art school was spent in this manner, although it was one of frustration from his teacher's lack of instruction. So his exposure to this practice may have led him to use this statue as a body model or double for Wood Nymph and Indian Maiden braiding her hair. So while Russell's mythological females are planted in the bloom of youth and placed in nature's landscape, so too are his Indian maidens. In the work Indian Maiden Braiding Her Hair, these two categories visibly merge as Russell shifts the portrayal of erotic desire from white women to American Indians. And we begin to visually equate an idealized primitive natural world and its beauty with that of Native Americans who are placed in juxtaposition to Anglo-Europeans. So as we saw previously in the paintings by Miller and Russell, Native American women and images of them were classified as exotic within the context of European and American cultural discourse, and they were frequently sexualized in the arts and literature of the period, alongside women from the Middle East, Asia, and Africa because of their racial heritage, darker skin tone, and non-Eurocentric culture, rather than because of any intrinsic qualities associated with the women themselves. So these stereotypes forged a link between exoticism and erotic appeal that became enshrined in one of the major art movements of the 19th century, Orientalism. So in both Renoir and Russell's works, we can find similarities in the female gaze as it confronts the viewer, who is often assumed male. So you see in their faces and in the presentation of their bodies this tension between a sensual invitation and a type of feminine challenge to male desire. Another catalyst for Orientalism's spread in wider American culture were the mammoth stagings of the world's fairs in the 19th and early 20th centuries, which were the largest centralized displays of international cultural achievement. Two of the most prominent in the United States were the 1893 Columbian Exhibition in Chicago and the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, which Russell both attended. Here, progress was not only demonstrated through exhibitions commemorating a unified white nation, but by juxtaposition, reinforced by the fairs, anthropology buildings, and carnivalesque grounds, dubbed the Midway in Chicago and the Pike in St. Louis. And the images here show the staging of the attraction, the Streets of Cairo, at various World's Fairs. And this is just a slide showing how that, it's a funny cartoon that says, they gained more traction and more male audiences when they changed the headline from Life in the Holy Land, Scenes from Biblical Days, to Life in the Harem, Dreamy Scenes in the Orient, and the Sultan's Diversions. So if you look at the architectural elements between this photograph of the World's Fair exhibit and Russell's painting, Street Scene in Arabia, you can see where he may have acquired visual source material for his art. Another possible inspiration for Russell's Arabian figures was the work of Mortimer Menpes, an Australian painter and etcher who made his home in England as a pupil and studio assistant of James McNeill Whistler. For Christmas 1903, C.S. Russell gifted his son a travelogue centering on India and Arab countries titled The Durbar, written by Dorothy Menpes and illustrated by her father. The pair produced these illustrated books of countries they visited, which included Japan, India, Mexico, Burma, Morocco, and Egypt. So I see some of the similarities in the softer palette of colors used and the types of figures, so you may be able to make some connections there. And one of Russell's most important early models was Nancy herself. Here we have two great photographs of her dressed in pseudo-Arabian attire. These were taken at her home in 4th Avenue North, and I know that because of the wallpaper, and we've been doing a renovation and conservation of the house, so hopefully we'll recreate that. But it shows that, maybe this photo shoot was inspired by a variety of things, the World's Fairs, 1001 Arabian Nights, but maybe it was an event closer to home that inspired them. So for a stretch of 6 days in July of 1901, the Great Falls businessmen secured the presence of a world-renowned attractions and oriental splendors put together by George Jabor Oriental Circus and Menagerie Company, a traveling circus and carnival whose owner had previously helped produce the attractions at the Midway in the World's Fair in Chicago. The 6-day carnival in Great Falls had 10 separate shows with 2 performances a day. The Midway, Streets of Cairo, Oriental Theater, Streets of All Nations, Mexican Theater, Algerian Theater, a German Village, an animal show, and a lunette and projectoscope. So the reporter in the article goes on to describe the Oriental Theater, which will host, quote, a coterie of houris, or beautiful young women who make up virgins in Muslim paradise, whose dark skin and darker eyes are fascinating as they twinkle like the stars newly flung from the hands of the Creator, unquote. Here is where La Belle Fatima and her world-famous troupe of muscle dancers, Freda, Rosa, Omina, and Sultana, will perform the Hoochie Coochie, which is a traditional Arabian dance, if you didn't know. But having been expressed through the words of authors and the canvases of painters and photographers and the stage of play actors, it was only natural that the film industry would take on the subject of Orientalism as well. So Russell was a film lover and frequented the cinema with Joe DeYoung in Great Falls, and in the 1920s he did so frequented with a Hollywood crowd in Southern California, where he had a lot of actor friends. So the 2 Russell works here resemble in appearance varying fictional characters, including the biblical Salome, the historical Cleopatra, and the fictional character in Gustave Flaubert's novel Salammbô. And one of the film actresses who portrayed both Cleopatra and Salome was Theda Bara, an iconic silent film actress who was the sort of vamp and vixen for Fox. Fox built up her mysterious appeal, saying her first name was an anagram that spelt death, and her last name read backwards as Arab, and she was born in the Sahara Desert in the shadow of the Sphinx. Quite mysterious. Her 2 films, Cleopatra and Salome, were some of her biggest hits, and they ran in theaters across the nation, including in Great Falls. Another connection could be made with the epic film production The 10 Commandments. Directed by Cecil DeMille, many of the desert scenes were shot on the California beach line, about 70 miles from Santa Barbara, where Russell was staying. In a later 1926 illustrated letter to Josephine Trigg, Russell writes, quote, "A few years ago you might have seen Moses and his bunch heading for the sea, somewhere between Long Beach and Santa Barbara. Maybe they had harps, but if they played, it was jazz music the same you'll hear at the Odan or Meadowlark Club. Moses is here yet. I saw him the other day. I don't know what he's doing now, but it's a safe bet he can't write the 10 Commandments," unquote. So Russell could have known DeMille himself, who directed a number of Western films. Edward Curtis, a photographer and friend of Russell's, was also working for DeMille at the time, and after Russell's death, Joe DeYoung, his protege, worked for DeMille. Now, to end on a Western note and one of female empowerment, I will turn to the fictional character of Hope Hathaway, one of my favorites. So Russell's illustrations for the novel are some of his strongest depictions of a female protagonist due to the fidelity with which he captured the spirit, independence, and empowerment embraced by the new modern woman of the 20th century. Hope Hathaway is a young woman raised on a Montana ranch who is unafraid of confrontation as she runs headlong into adventure as a school teacher for a mixed-race family. In between teaching the children, she falls in love with a dashing sheep rancher and saves his livestock from a group of cattle ranchers and nearby rustlers who are angry over the introduction of sheep to the area. She is handy with a firearm and unafraid to shoot to wound, as this image of Russell's shows here. So for this character, we have to thank a little-known Western author, Frances Parker. In 1891, at 16, Frances Parker left her upper-class family home in Detroit to live with her uncle in Wolf Point, Montana. Soon after, she met and married C.M. Jacobs, the foreman at the N-Bar N cattle ranch, where she lived for 3 years and likely first met Russell, who had worked in area roundups. So in 1893, Jacobs quit the ranch to raise sheep on a homestead the couple purchased near the Bears Paw Mountains. And by 1902, however, Parker had grown apart from her older husband and her life in Montana, so she divorced him and moved back to Detroit, where her father still lived. But while in Detroit, she began her writing, which focused on Western life. Parker's first novel, Margie of the Lower Ranch, did not pack the same writerly punch as would her second, and neither did its illustrations. A Boston illustrator, Victor A. Searles, was in charge of bringing Margie to life. His illustrations are awash in high romance and the look of an imaginary West. Clearly, he didn't have the lived experience that Russell did. In particular, the frontispiece titled Margie was speeding rapidly across the prairie shows neither prairie nor haste, and a book reviewer from the period describes the picture thusly, quote, Margie in a red riding habit on a horse twice as high as a big fir tree is galloping towards the spectator with a sun that fills nearly half the picture. It is both great and lurid, unquote, lurid indeed. That book didn't sell so well, and thankfully for her second novel, Parker changed tactics, creating a stronger female character with a more exciting plot and choosing a true-to-life Western artist to do the illustrations. A newspaper at the time credits Parker with taking a train ride all the way from Detroit to Great Falls to ask Russell in person to be the illustrator. And of course, he agreed. So upon receiving Russell's drawings, Frances Parker said, quote, I would cry, they are so intimately my own, made for me by my very good friend, unquote. Her strong reaction to them testifies to the degree to which the artist captured the character of Hope, and in some ways of Parker herself. So Nancy once wrote in a letter to Ralph Budd, then president of the Great Northern Railroad Company, that Russell, quote, cannot draw a pretty girl or people in up-to-date clothing, but he does know and feel the romance of the West of yesterday and known its people as well as its animals, their lives, and the magic that held them there, unquote. Nancy, of course, wrote that to protect Russell's integrity so that he would not have to paint trains in marketing advertisements for the railroad company, and so that he could stick to subjects that he enjoyed. But if we look closely, we can see that Russell, in fact, knew how to paint a good-looking woman, even one in up-to-date Western duds. And from all the visual evidence we have of Hope Hathaway, she was one tough cookie, a real Western woman, much like Nancy Russell herself. So thank you. And I'm back to introduce our next speaker, my esteemed colleague, Jennifer Bottomley O'Looney, who is the senior curator of the Montana Historical Society. She has curated a number of major exhibitions, including the reinterpretation and reinstallation of the McKay Gallery of Charles M. Russell Art, and is co-author with Kirby Lambert of Montana's Charlie Russell Art in the Collection of the Montana Historical Society. She sits on the board of Blackfeet Pathways, Sculpture in the Wild International Sculpture Park, which features a variety of site-specific artworks created by contemporary artists and is located in Lincoln, Montana. If you have any time after this weekend to visit, you should. And she is currently working on a major exhibition of the Western artist and Russell friend Joseph Shirley to open this fall at the Montana Historical Society. So her talk will feature the life of Leila V. Roberts, a close friend of Nancy and Charlie, and the collection of works housed at the Montana Historical Society.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here with all you, my friends and colleagues. At the Montana Historical Society, we have a rather unusual artifact. In the winter of 1913, Charlie and Nancy Russell dined at the home of their friends, their longtime friends, Leila and Ben Roberts. Saved as a keepsake from the event was a memento placed in a small envelope, upon which Leila V. Roberts wrote, "This envelope contains Charlie's match and cigarette smoked by Chaz M. Russell, the cowboy artist in my house in December 1st, 1913. What compelled Leila to gather such an unusual treasure with her, from her longtime friend? Well, first we'll talk a little bit about Ben and Leila. Leela was born in 1862 and came to Montana with her family in the 1860s when she was a young girl. Prior to the Civil War, Leela's parents, Thomas L. Gorham and Sarah Vivian Gorham, owned a large cotton farm called College Mound, Macon County, Missouri. And this is a needlepoint that Sarah made and then brought with her to Montana of her treasured home in Missouri. The U.S. federal census for the 1860s shows the Gorham holdings of 2,000 acres, valued at $44,000, the equivalent of $750,000 in today's value. And Missouri was torn apart by the Civil War. The Gorhams, however, were Southern sympathizers. Leela recalled that as a young girl, she was caught by a Union officer, a captain, while attempting to deliver socks to Confederate soldiers behind Yankee lines. The Union captain returned her to her home unmolested and unhumiliated, quote unquote. Perhaps to escape the turmoil of the war, the Gorham traveled to Alder Gulch in 1864 via wagon train and set up a store in Virginia City. He engaged in mining and in the cattle trade. He then returned to Missouri to bring his wife Sarah, who was reportedly a beautiful Southern girl, and his young daughter to Montana. Now, among the family treasures that they brought with them to the Montana Territory were several small keepsakes. This is a candy cherub. It's really no bigger than this, made out of pressed sugar, as well as this little rooster with little chicks beside it. They were placed in a collar box, along with, you can see behind them, a tuft of cotton from the home in College Mound. Thomas Gorham, later regarded as the father of Cascade, Montana, soon purchased large amounts of property in the Chestnut Valley, which lies between the present-day Cascade and the Little Belt Mountains along the Missouri River. And he moved his family to Ulidia, a ferry crossing located on the east side of the Missouri River opposite present-day Cascade. He also acquired land on the west side of the Missouri River, and on this land he platted what would become the city of Cascade. Here he prospered, opening the town's first post office out of his home, and as well as establishing a separate, successful mercantile business. Now, Leela Gorham grew up in comfort to become what the Sun River Sun described as a charming young lady. She was also sent east for education, traveling by stagecoach to Fort Benton, and then down the Missouri River via riverboat, and eventually to Galesburg, Illinois, where she attended seminary school for 3 years. This studio photograph was taken while she was in Galesburg. And in the Chestnut Valley, she was active in social circles of young men and women. She was a member of the Pastime Club, which provided entertainment every month to raise funds for the Cascade Christian Church. The Rocky Mountain Husbandmen declared one such event held winter evening in 1881 a great success, reporting that everyone was surprised at the dramatic talent displayed, and each actor or person taking part is complimented for some special feature. And the songs were rendered in an appreciative manner by several young ladies, including Leela, who performed the Echo song, and it was highly entertaining and well received, reported by the paper. Like Leela, Ben Rohr Roberts and his family hailed from Missouri in 1863. When Ben was just 2 years old, his father, William Roberts, brought his family to Virginia City. Shortly thereafter, the family settled in Helena. Ben's father became a prominent citizen of Helena. He was the first sheriff of Lewis and Clark County and then county treasurer for many years, and he prospered. The Roberts' wealth befriended the family to live in relative luxury. The household included 7 members: William, his wife Mary, children Joseph and Ben, who were born in Missouri, and Sally Bet and Mary, who were born in Montana. But also who lived with the family was a Chinese-born servant named Sing Connick. In 1882, 19-year-old Ben went into partnership with well-known Wyoming saddle maker named William Glassman and opened the Cheyenne Saddle Shop located on Main Street in Helena. These gentlemen will make stock saddles a specialty, the Helena Independent reported, and guarantee to turn out the best in the territory for their customers. The Helena Weekly Herald echoed the sentiment, proclaiming, The cowboys of Montana are acknowledged to be fond of indulging in exaggerated and forcible language at times. The latest byword among them takes the form of swearing by the Cheyenne saddle. Roberts and Glassman have created a furor throughout the territory by the style of saddle they are manufacturing. The shop specialized in saddles that were hand-tooled with either a horse or a cow engraved into the saddle. And here is a saddle by Ben Roberts. And there you can see, you can just barely make out probably the horse engraved in the side. In 1883, Roberts bought out the Glassman's interest in the shop and became sole proprietor. The Herald said, "Our enterprising young townsman, Ben Roberts, has purchased the Glassman's share in the saddlery and harness shop. Mr. Roberts is well fitted to take charge of the establishment. His past work is guaranteed that the new firm will be successful." Ben later recalled that after opening his saddlery, he'd first heard of Russell painting pictures on the Roundup, and he wrote to Russell to ask him to paint a picture for his shop, but Charlie sent him something that wasn't quite what he was looking for. Nevertheless, they wrote and became, for many times before they finally met to become friends. They first met when Charlie rode up to the saddle shop on his pinto pony, introducing himself, saying, "Hello, Ben." Surprised, Roberts asked how Russell knew him, and Charlie responded, "I was told if I found a man homelier than I am, it would be Ben Roberts." Yeah. Their friendship would last their lifetimes. Early on, Ben was interested in promoting Russell's work. He'd acquired the famed watercolor Waiting for Chinook, which we saw a little earlier. And then Roberts bought the sketch from Louis Kaufman and copyrighted it for sale as a widely distributed postcard. Russell did advertising work for Roberts as well. One such sketch as an advertising card, "I bought my saddle at Ben Roberts," appears to be rendered in Russell's style. So to the left you have the back of the card, which shows the prices of the saddles, and the other side is the advertising side. And it is thought that the drawing here was rendered by Russell. Not quite 3 years before Russell drew Waiting for a Chinook, Ben and Leela were married at Leela's parents' home in Ulidia. Reporting the event in September of 1884, the Herald said, "The groom has gone from childhood to manhood, where he has ever been known for his industry and enterprise, and the bride is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas L. Gorham of Ulidia, early pioneers of Montana. Hearty congratulations of the Herald are extended to the bride and groom for long and happy lives." The couple lived in Helena while Ben ran his saddle shop, and here Charlie found a welcome home away from home. At this point in his life, Charlie was still riding the range, working as a cowboy, drifting between towns across Montana. He would occasionally sell paintings in towns such as Helena and Great Falls, but he was a long way from becoming the successful artist. Roberts recalled, "I never knew when Charlie was coming or when he was going to leave. He just was part of the family." And when Charlie ventured to Alberta, Canada in 1888, it was to Ben Roberts he wrote to announce where he'd landed. "I reached my stopping place," he announced. "I'm staying at a cattle ranch in High River. Give my best regards to Mrs. Roberts and everybody." When Charlie's mother wrote to Ben to ask how her son was getting along, Ben turned the letter over to Mrs. Roberts to respond. Thereafter, Leela, although only 2 years Russell Sr., took over the role of surrogate mother, often writing to Charlie's mother to keep her apprised of her wayward son's comings and goings. Sometime later, the couple moved to Cascade to be near Leela's family. Ben clerked in his father-in-law's mercantile until Thomas Gorham's death in 1891. They remained in Cascade, settling into her father's home, raising 3 children, Gorham, a son, daughters Hebe and Vivian. And here, Charlie also found a second home, where he set up a studio in a small shack behind Robert's place. Ben remembered, "Charlie used to tell the fellows on the Roundup just for fun, 'Well, when I get to Butte, I'll get enough money from John Campbell to get to Helena. At Helena, I'll get more money from Jess Phelps to get to Ben Roberts' place. And at Cascade, then I'm good for all winter.'" And Charlie loved the Roberts children. He, the youngest, recalled that when Charlie came to visit, the first thing he would do is pick us up in his arms and make a big fuss over us. He'd spend hours amusing us. He always insisted on helping Mother at everything from carrying water to peeling potatoes or hanging up clothes. Sometimes he'd get in her way, and she'd shoo him away. Go draw pictures for the children, she'd insist. Interested in furthering promoting Russell's work, Ben persuaded Charlie to do a series of pictures illustrating life in the West. Roberts had the resulting 12 pictures printed by the Albertite Company of New York, and they were bound into a slim volume titled Studies in Western Life, copyrighted in 1890. And Charlie gave drawings and paintings to Leela over the years. The first, perhaps, which was the oil painting Lolly, in which Russell depicts Laura Edgar, his first youthful love. It was painted in 1892, many years after Charlie and Laura had parted ways. And it's very much atypical from the more common subject matters of Russell. Lolly was enthusiastically received when first exhibited in 1892 in the window of Calkins department store in Great Falls. As reported by the leader, C.M. Russell, better known as the cowboy artist, it has another picture at Calkins. The picture represents a maiden gathering water lilies from a pool in the woods and shows the same artistic ability and he has characterized from his pictures of cowboy life. In 1895, while living in Cascade, Charlie went to dinner at the home of his friends. The Roberts had taken in a young woman named Nancy Mann, who we mentioned before, to help with the household chores. A native of Kentucky, Nancy had arrived at Roberts' home by way of Helena at the age of 16, having lost her mother and having had her stepfather abandon her. Now at 17, she was 14 years younger than Russell and was later described by Charlie's nephew, Austin, as a pretty blonde girl, plump and squeezable, an attractive laugh, nice manners, very little education, with nothing whatsoever to show she was smart as a steel trap and as quick as a lash of a whip. Charlie was enamored by Nancy, and she was equally taken with him. Recalling the night they first met at the Robertses, Nancy wrote, "The picture that is engraved in my mind and in my memory is of a man of a little above average height and weight, wearing a soft shirt, a Stetson hat on the back of his blonde head, trousers held up by a half-breed sash that clung just above his hip bones, high-heeled riding boots on very small arched feet, gray deep blue set eyes that seemed to see everything, both with an expression of honesty and understanding. His hands were good size, perfectly shaped, with long, slender fingers. Everyone noticed his artistic, sensitive hands that had the great strength and charm." Less than a year later, Charlie drew this sketch, Mosquito Season in Cascade, for Leela, who, while visiting Great Falls, wrote home inquiring about the mosquito situation. In responding to her letter, Russell depicts himself awkwardly drying the dishes while Nancy washes them in Leela's kitchen. Both are surrounded by swarms of pesky mosquitoes that are prevalent on as we all know, are prevalent on the Missouri River in the summer. And so smitten was Russell during the months of their courtship, the once rowdy cowboy portrayed himself willing to do domestic chores just to be by Nancy's side. And then Leela later added, it may be a little hard for you guys to see, but she wrote an inscription that points out Russell's depiction of the original post office operated by her father, Thomas Gorham. She wrote, "First P.O. at Cascade, which was the home of Thomas L. Gorham, the founder of the town." And here's a little pencil sketch that he drew during the romantic time leading up to their marriage. It's titled Mamie Man, his pet name for Nancy throughout their marriage. And I'm sorry, some of the credits cut off a little bit on the side there. They were married in 1896 in a ceremony at Roberts' home. The bride wore a blue wedding dress that Leela Roberts made for her, and the event was newsworthy. The Anaconda Standard reported, "Wednesday evening at the residence of Mr. and Mrs. B.R. Roberts, Miss Mamie Mann and Charles M. Russell were united in marriage. The occasion was one of the most pleasant social events ever held in Cascade, where the couple have many friends. And it continued saying, Charlie Russell, the happy groom, is known all over the West as the cowboy artist, and now, more than ever, he will confine himself to his profession. In the classic language of Charlie, he's done settled down to business and can't trot with the gang anymore. And they honeymooned in the small 12 by 24 foot shack behind Robert's house where they would make their home until they moved to Great Falls in 1887. And as Joan mentioned before, as I was, and as I am now, were sent as thank you notes to his pals at the Silver Dollar Bar, who had chipped in together for the wedding gift of the silver service you see depicted. And as Brian mentioned, was so useful to the starving couple. But the drawing conveyed the message that his life had dramatically changed, mostly for the better. He was hitched and the old ways had passed. Little technical finagling going on here. That's okay. Thanks for trying. Are we okay? Okay. And as Emily mentioned, my Valentine made for Leela for a candy booth that she had as a church social. And during the summer after the first year they were married. And I speculate that perhaps it was influenced by Leela's treasured candy cherub, or maybe the numerous Valentine postcards that were popular during the late 1880s or early 1900s, such as those. Or he may have seen this Valentine that was published in the Anaconda Standard, a portrait Valentine poem by Charles Kelsey Gaining, and illustrated with a beautiful lady with cherubs and framed in filigree. By 1906, Leela and Ben had moved back to Helena, where Ben became the proprietor of the Acme Advertising Sign Company. This is the letterhead of the time that Ben started the Acme Company. Between 1916 and 1920, Leela is listed in the Polk Helena City Directories as president of the Acme Bulletin Company, and Ben is listed as vice president. The Acme Company offered a wide range of services, including electric signs, pictorial bulletins, scenic paintings, anything in signs, advertising, show cards, bill posting, and distributing. Later, the Polk Helena City Directories list Ben and Leela at 107 North Warren, where Ben displayed and sold reproductions of original Russell paintings for many years after Charlie died in 1926. And this is a picture of Ben out front of his shop in 1937. And then Leela Roberts died in August of 1940. Throughout her life, she clearly cherished the friendship that she and her husband shared with the Montana cowboy artist. By the time Charlie smoked the now well-preserved cigarette at her home in the winter of 1913, Russell was at the zenith of his artistic career. The previous year, he'd finished his magnificent mural, Lewis and Clark Meeting the Indians at Ross's Hole, for the Montana State House Chambers. He had also received much acclaim for a second, highly successful exhibit at the Folsom Galleries in New York, as well as for exhibit at the Calgary Stampede in Alberta. Perhaps wanting to capture a token of a small part of her dear friend's fame, Leela saved the treasured burnt match and flattened stubs of Charlie's rolled Durham tobacco cigarette, which is now a treasure at the Montana Historical Society. Thank you.
Our final introduction and our final speaker, Tom Petrie. Tom has that job of batting cleanup, which is always kind of tough, but he's up to it. Just as it's hard to imagine Charlie Russell as a prolific artist and an American icon without his wife, Nancy, in the picture, it's just as impossible to believe that we would be looking forward to the opening of an exhibition entitled Charles M. Russell, The Women in His Life and Art, without Tom Petrie. Tom provided the spark that got this project going, truly, and he's also given us the vision, support, and enthusiasm that are rapidly moving it to the finish line. Tom, as you undoubtedly know, is one of the great Russell collectors of all time, and he and his wife, Jane, are one of the principal lenders to the exhibition, the others being, of course, the Montana Historical Society and the C.M. Russell Museum. He also is the catalyst for some other loans that we were lucky to get. Tom is a well-known American philanthropist. Besides leading the board of the Russell Museum, Tom's been an incredibly generous donor and board member to many other organizations, including the Gettysburg Foundation, Gilcrease Museum, and the Denver Art Museum, where he led the fundraising to endow my old department, the Petrie Institute of Western American Art. Unbelievable but true, Tom also has a day job as chairman of Petrie Partners. He's enjoyed a long and stellar career as an investment banker and an internationally renowned authority on the global energy industry. Tom's a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point. He received his graduate degree from Boston University. Like me, he's an Easterner who came west and fell in love. His talk today is based on a manuscript by Nancy Russell that she assembled with the intention of publishing it as a biography of her husband after his death. She never did finish it. Tom is now preparing the manuscript for publication by the University of Oklahoma Press. He also wrote an essay in our catalog, which is based upon that manuscript. Today you're going to get a sneak preview of some pretty delightful material. Please join me in welcoming Tom Petrie.
Thank you very much, Joan. It's a pleasure to be here. And, you know, I knew when I was stepping into the role of chair of the Russell Museum, I wanted something that would be organizing for our staff and energizing for the institution as we begin some other initiatives. And I thought once I came up with that idea, my job was done. And then, truly to my surprise, did Brian and Joan come back and say, no, you need to be also writing one of these. And I thought, well, that's not hard. I'll just lightly edit what Nancy wrote and send it to them. And I was in Maine for a week or so, and I did that, sent it back. And then Dr. and Dr. Dippie and Dr. Troccoli told me I'd failed the course. And so what do I have to do then? And I listened to it, and at some stress to my marriage to my dear wife, Jane, I spent another week to week and a half, 12-hour days in Maine, not doing much other than thinking and so on. They said, there needs to be more of you in this as a foil for dealing with what Nancy had to say. And I survived it. So far, my marriage has survived it, but that's a continuing saga. And so I am only going to give you some gleanings from this, but it was not my idea to do it in the first place. And the one thing I'll say that I came away with this is with incredibly further elevated esteem for each of the people at this table and what they do professionally. So I'll let you judge the rest of that. No, don't. So these are recollections and some thoughts that I have on recollections and personal perspectives of Nancy Russell. And I'm going to try to compress a little bit of this as a way to maybe incentivize you to read the essay at a later date. Nancy is often depicted and perceived as a tough negotiator and a very shrewd businesswoman. And she certainly was. And she certainly was one who proved to be a critical determinant of her husband's commercial success as an artist. While there's lots of evidence to support that thesis, what I hope you'll come away with from some of these comments today is that she was also an incredibly sensitive, complex, and talented human being. For 31 years, she really was the most important person in this artist's daily endeavors. And without her, as we all know, it's become cliche to say he would never have achieved what he did, but it's true. You've already heard some things from the prior speakers about this, so I'm going to move on in the interest of time and just compress things a bit. When Nancy was reflecting on their first year of marriage, he said, he wrote home, and he said, "Cupid has bushwhacked me. He shot me when I wasn't looking." And this is telling him he's planning to get married. "Until now, I haven't thought much about flowers, but this girl of mine loves them so much, I'm falling for them too." So begins Nancy's chapter titled Cascade, Montana. What I'm going to do is talk about Cascade, the first two, the Cascade and the first year in Great Falls. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about something 10 years later at Bullhead Lodge. And then finally, I'm going to, in a compressed way, I'll talk about a trip they took just before World War I, 1914 in the spring, and some of the things that are revealing about their relationship there. And hopefully with that, you'll be inclined to read the more complete essay that I've tried to put together. And the second time around, they said, "Well, you haven't failed the course yet. We'll see how it goes." You've already heard about the marriage part, so I'm going to skip along on that. The role of the Roberts in fostering the meeting of Charlie and Nancy, and I suspect really encouraging Charlie to think about this opportunity is really critical. But what I want to do now is begin to describe what happened thereafter. And if I can avoid the problems here. Okay, I see why. Joan, I can see why you had the problem. I have it too, but I'm going to try not to let that happen. So we get right on beyond that. Here's where they first lived. Folklore says it might even have been a converted chicken coop, but it was a small cabin. It's still there today to be seen. And my congratulations, I believe, to Jean Dwyer, who has faithfully tried to preserve this and provided us a chance to see what that first year might have been like. Times were really tight for him. And in that period, there was Charlie didn't have a suit for the wedding, but a fellow named Flynn of the dry goods firm right down the street of Shepard and Flynn lent him a suit. Charlie also didn't have the money to pay for the rental of the suit, so he painted a painting, kind of imaginary, but it's kind of Charlie in a role of finding a card shark, cheating at cards, and Charlie drawing, as I see it anyway, Charlie drawing the gun on him. It's called, talks about activity at the Peacefully Valley Saloon. And that painting has been reproduced. We've had some of the prints for sale in the early auctions in the last few years because the grandson of Flynn has told us the story of Charlie giving this as his way of saying thank you for the suit that I couldn't afford to buy, but I needed for the wedding. The key thing that really characterizes those first years is some evidence that Charles Schatzline, the the friend as well as merchant of art supplies and paint in Butte, said when he came to visit Charlie and Nancy shortly after they'd moved from Cascade, where they'd figured out that the market wasn't going to be big enough for Charlie's art. And I suspect it was Nancy's judgment that said, we've got to get over there to that rapidly growing city of Great Falls with its cheap electricity, the copper refining industry, and the first electrification of a city in America because of the hydroelectricity. So they get over there. Charles Schwarzlein comes, and as a friend, he visits, and he says, you know, Russell, you don't ask enough for your pictures. From that last bunch you sent me, I sold one for enough to pay for 6. I'm paying your price, but that's not enough. I think your wife should take hold of that end of the game and help you out. So as it progresses beyond that, and unfortunately this isn't that clear, I can assure you that the catalog that I hope you'll all buy has a much better reproduction of that. And I thank 2 of the people in this room who have given us their menu cards. What we have here is a dinner arranged by a friend for 125 guests involving menus for Christmas time, shortly after Charlie and Nancy moved to Cascade. And so Charlie, wanting to give people something of value, agrees that for the total sum of $20, he'll put an individualized watercolor image on each one of those cards. And Nancy observes, after she worked out the arithmetic, she wasn't highly educated, but she could do arithmetic in particular if it involved dollars. And when you divide 125 into 20, you come up with 16 cents per menu. And she said, right there we had a real fuss. He had worked days on them, and I thought he should have at least as much as the cook and waiters would get per day. He thought so too, but did not have the courage to ask for enough for us to live on and save a cent. Well, Nancy soon proved that she was ready to provide the courage. And sometimes she was criticized for doing that, but the fact of the matter was she had a notion of what his art was worth, and it really guided her for many, many years to come. One example of that is really a vignette that I as a collector, became thrilled about. A visit up here about a few years back with Trevor Reese-Jones. Talked to Trevor, and we knew that the Gaylord collection had come available from Phil Anschutz, who'd bought the Broadmoor Hotel. But he felt he had enough paintings already, and he was probably right about that. In any case, this painting came out of the Gaylord collection, and it was a little bit of the advisory fee I got from my friend Trevor, who bought most of those paintings. And it's a real interesting painting. It's called Waiting for the Herd to Cross. And here's Nancy's account from that document I'm working with. The title of this part of the book is Great Falls, Our First Real Money, Second Christmas, 1897-98. One day we met a woman who wanted a watercolor of a steamboat stopped by a buffalo crossing the Missouri River. The finished piece was a beauty, and we thought it should bring a good price. Charlie hoped the buyer would pay $25. We needed hay for the horses, and I wanted a new cook stove. So I asked if I couldn't deliver the picture. Charlie cautioned her. Now, Mame, if you ask more than that, the $25 for that picture, she won't take it, and we need the money. But Our Lady saw the beauty of the picture and was much pleased. She asked, how much does Mr. Russell want for it? Nancy replied, with a choking sensation, I said $35. Just wait and I'll get you a check, she said. Nancy adds, and I must say Mary Jane does this much better than I do. I shared this with her, and this is one of those authentic presentations she makes. So I'll get through this and let you listen to her presentations in the future. With a choking sensation, she said $35, just wait and I'll get you the check. Glory be, I had $10 toward the new cook stove. Charlie got as great a thrill out of that piece of paper as he did when I handed him a check for $30,000 when he quietly said, I can't read so many figures. What do they say? That's the reference that Brian made earlier today. As this story illustrates, Nancy did not lack determination, and it helped make her successful. And as we heard earlier today from Brian, in a series of transactions thereafter, she moved him to various levels over the years. A decade later, just over a decade beyond when they were married, Brian gave this account at Coeur d'Alene a little over a decade ago, that Nancy had a letter from Malcolm McKay, an investment banker from a firm that the first firm I worked for on Wall Street used to compete with, as it turns out, but a century later, of course. But in any case, it was a situation where Malcolm McKay said he admired Mr. Russell's work very much, and he just wondered whether that painting that she had priced at $1,000 might be bought for $800, given that the stock market was down in the aftermath of the San Francisco earthquake. And Nancy wrote back to say how pleased that she and Charlie were that he admired Mr. Russell's work. But apparently he didn't realize that Mr. Russell did not discount his work, the price of his work. And so she did add that when you get things right in that money store you run, something along those lines, they would be pleased to sell him that piece of work at the offered price. And this was a lady who reminded me a lot of my dad's mother, my grandmother, who had that sharp tongue and came from humble circumstances, but was not afraid, no matter who she was talking to express what was on her mind. And that's maybe why I find this such a joy to work with Nancy and some of this account that I luckily came across. Moving on, this was some of the pricing. This is the most thrilling acquisition I've made in the collection. It was sold by Nancy in 1919 for $6,000. I'll ask some help from Jen a little later to work that into today's price, but it's a big number, believe me. But this next one, and again, the bleeding out of this I apologize for, but this is part of the fun of collecting is you come across things and you have epiphanies for sure, but you come across the unexpected time and again. And in the great gift to the Denver Art Museum by the Harmson family, we came across something in the files. Thomas Smith and Peter Hasrick did. These are sketches done at Bullhead Lodge in 1906-07. The first time, right after the completion of it in 1906, when Philip R. Goodwin went there with Charlie to inscribe on the fireplace various images along with Charlie. He also did other sketches, and this is Nancy, and this one doesn't catch it so well, but you'll see it again in the book we all want you to buy. The posture of Nancy sitting there with real pride. You're looking at her in the back, but you can just fill in the rest of the story about how proud she is because they built this out of those cents that she talked about saving when we got those paintings priced right. And they built it. She was proud of it, and it had a great, great influence on them thereafter. So I'm going to work toward that point pretty quickly. The way I'd say it is this: the importance of the Russells' time spent at Bullhead Lodge as an uplifting force for both Charlie's creativity and Nancy's marketing is difficult to overstate. As Nancy recounts, Charlie was happy hearing the language of animals, and I've skipped some parts you can pick up in the later as a support for this. He loved all the outdoors west of the Mississippi, but the loneliness of a big city overwhelmed him. Crowds of human beings made him feel crushed and suffocated. He wanted a clear view. He wanted to take a deep breath that had not been breathed by others. And so it really captures something. Bullhead Lodge really provided the stimulus that was needed. From 1907 onwards, as Nancy continued to raise her art sales expectations, the advances in the quality of Charlie's work are undeniable. Over the next 5 years, he produced 17, or more than 1/3 of what Russell historian Fred Renner considered to be the artist's 50 greatest paintings. Bill Foxley asked for that list from Fred Renner, and he guided Bill in building the collection he had. And that's a third of the paintings in the 5 years after they started spending every summer at Bullhead Lodge. It was about 25%, it was 25% of the total time they spent there, but it was a third of his output. It really lifted it when you realize year after year after year in that first half decade, how much more happened. And if you get to the end of that year, that's 1911, and that's when you see, and this is the part I skipped, Deer at Lake McDonald and the wildlife stuff that you can get later. But that's when you see Charlie working on, in the wake of the Buffalo Hunters, the cover of the retrospective that Joan curated when we did that at the Denver Art Museum a decade or so ago. But there's Charlie with Fergus and another party I can't identify, but Brian can tell you later who it is, or Larry can. But here we are with in the wake of the Buffalo Hunters, one of the greatest paintings Russell did, and just a fantastic painting. And all the ones leading up to that fall in that same kind of category. So then we move on, and there's a birch bark. We're stepping back in time, but just to touch on it, this is a note from Charlie to the Calverts who were involved with building the cabin, and there's reference here that only occurs here, and thereafter it goes away. And I bring it in for that reason. It's a Happy New Year's wishes to the Calverts, and it's down at the bottom it says from Kootenai Lodge. Now he may have changed it, they may have decided to change it because there was another Kootenai Lodge that Charlie visits just 6 weeks before he dies. But I think it's more than that. I think Nancy quickly, and I know Brian believes this too, they really changed it because Nancy figured out we need to call it Bullhead Lodge. And they feel that way because as she saw it, the branding was really important, and Charlie having already incorporated the buffalo skull into his signing of the paintings, Bullhead Lodge, they wanted everybody to know that Charlie owned Bullhead Lodge. And that leads into the marketing genius of Nancy. When they go to London in 1914, and again, the bleeding out of this, I'm quite sure, is not going to be there in the book, but here's the toll collector's painting. He painted in 1913, the year before they go there. Excuse me. By that time, we have improved printing techniques, so they have chromolithographs. Nancy says, I wonder what I can do to stimulate people to really appreciate Charlie's storytelling ability and the use of color and the use of really dramatic Western landscapes. Why don't we get a whole bunch of these chromolithographs? And Charlie, when you come in, just sit down at the desk and sign these because we want an original autograph on each of these chromolithographs, and I'll hand them out as free eye candy in London so people can get kind of enticed into what you're doing and how you do it and so on. Or as our friend Larry Peterson said, if Nancy were alive today, she'd use every technique available to chum the waters and to network and get out there and so on. He didn't use the word chum the waters, that's my term. That's what she's doing with this. But Larry's observation in the documentary was right on point, and she never missed a chance to think about the marketing aspects. With some luck, as I work my way through this, I may bring up another example or two of that. But that's one of the big ones in my mind. Another thing that happened, that trip to London really lifted it, really lifted how they approach things. When I bought the Signal Smoke, a Major Russell painting, I asked Brian to write a paper for me that would help me better appreciate it. And one of the key things about Signal Smoke was that Nancy had already worked on the marketing using Charlie's paintings in calendars so that they'd be sold, the image would be sold around the country, initially out of a Great Falls-based company, and then later out of a New Jersey-based company with a national footprint. And so in 1912, he did that painting, and then they took it to London, and it got mixed reviews. Some people liked it, some people had some observations that were at least somewhat questioning of it. Charlie brings it home, repaints it, and Brian gave me some good tips on how well to appreciate that, and he re-signs it. You can even see where he painted over the original signature, but you can see it bleed through a bit, and now it's signed 1915, C.M. Russell. And Nancy really understood the importance of that marketing and so on, and so she was working with each of these paintings that became part of the calendar and whatnot. And Charlie, having seen a lot of art, so much that he got pretty tired of it by the time they got to Paris, and as he walked past what I think he referred to as 700 miles of paintings in Paris, that even he felt like he was overdone. But there's no question in my mind as I look at what he did thereafter, it was really uplifted. Well, Nancy also had some, and they went to a place called the Wallace Collection, which I was clueless about until Joan was kind enough Joan and Robert gave me a gift that talked a lot about the Wallace Collection. So I said to my wife, Jane, do you know the Wallace Collection? She said, oh yeah, I used to visit it when I was a kid. And so we went there a few weeks ago. And one of the things that Nancy says in her unpublished book was, or manuscript is a better description, I think. She said, she talked about after being at the Wallace Collection, they were really enticed to see a whole lot of miniature paintings there. And she said, you know, Charlie was particularly taken by some. So I tried to go see those, and I saw a lot of miniatures. There's 1,000 miniatures in the Wallace Collection. The collection had been built over several centuries by the families, and then it was given to the people of the United Kingdom in 1897. It was open to the public when Charlie and Nancy got there in 1914, and it was open to Jane and me when we got there a few weeks ago. But 1,000, I never found the one that Charlie was inspired, but one of my favorite paintings of all time is a relatively rare nocturne by Charlie is Joshing Moon, 13 by 9, so 9 by 13 inches. So it's a miniature, and I really do think he was inspired by what he saw there, and Nancy made comment about it in the text. But I wouldn't be surprised, and I'm speculating here, but what Nancy, having made that comment in the text, may well have said to Charlie as well, why don't you do one of those miniatures and see what you can do? And certainly that one measured up as a great one. And there it is. Sometime if you're in Colorado, I'd love to show it to you. You've already heard about Russell's sense of humor. Since this one has a tie back to interpretations of and comments by Charlie on women, I wanted to include it in my paper. And this is to his friend Hiram. And with Hiram, he says, Hiram was another owner, as I understand it, of a bar here. And Charlie's talking about, and it's a little bit looking like Charlie leaning the bar with the lady bartender, and he's commenting as he sends one of the first letters back from London to his friend that he had noticed a very distinguished gentleman over on the right-hand side, and he had also noticed that there were a number of well-inebriated people in there, mostly men, I think entirely men, and they were well-behaved. And he doesn't say it directly, but the implication is he was quite surprised they were so well-behaved with an attractive woman bartender. And but then he started thinking about it because the guy had his back to him, and when he turned around and he looked at the gentleman, he was quite distinguished, but he started speculating about the leaded quirt and the knuckles, the brass knuckles that he probably had in his pocket, and that was why the well-inebriated men were so well behaved, and somewhat to his surprise. And then he goes on to, and when I saw that, I loved that one, so it was easy to say I needed that in the collection, because I remember reading that here in Great Falls, also attended by men who were presumably reasonably well inebriated, it was considered appropriate to close the bar sometimes during the week in the afternoon, so ladies who wanted to be able to look at Russell paintings could attend without the men present. So you can see why he was wanting to share that insight with a bar owner back here. But Nancy wanted to go to Paris, and I'm going to wrap up on this. Nancy wanted to go to Paris, and she had a lot of things she wanted to do. She wanted to see the Eiffel Tower, she wanted to go to Fontainebleau, and she wanted to walk in the woods where Marie Antoinette had walked. With all that said, she never got to do any of those things. But she did have a really interesting story that shows the depth of her character and her ability to share something that was a humiliating incident. I'm not going to tell you about that today because I want you to buy the book. But so I'm just going to get to the last page here, which at least I hope to do that. And I would say that incident relates to the movie Pretty Woman, just to give you a little more enticement, because there's an incident in there, like the snubbing incident in Pretty Woman, that she went through, and she dealt with it. So it speaks to why I have great admiration for this woman. Throughout her life, Nancy consistently demonstrated an uncommon ability to overcome adversity and refocus on her priority goals. Her role in double harness, as Charlie termed it, was well and largely self-defined. She pulled her full share of the managerial and marketing load to advance Charlie's wide-ranging artistic works. For example, Ed Barine, after Charlie died and she decided that, on advice of editors, she needed to publish the first book that contained a whole lot of his humor and his philosophy of life in those illustrated letters called Good Medicine. She decided that she wanted to do it. But she had crossed paths with a lot of Charlie's friends and really irritated them. And a number of them said, "No way, I'm never giving that to you to publish because I don't like you. You kept us apart from Charlie at times that we didn't like." Well, Ed Barine stepped in and turned some of them around. Not all of them. Some of them never came around, but Ed Barine did. And this is, I think, an insight into her humanity, her understanding how helpful those who were friends to her could be. And she writes in the presentation copy of Good Medicine to Ed Barine, "Ed Barine, friendships like yours and Charlie's are the most precious gift of God. It makes my heart glad to see your name woven into these pages of history left by Charlie for lovers of the Old West and its people. I give you this book as a token of appreciation for the part you've played in making it possible. Nancy C. Russell, April 19th, 1930, 4 years after, and coincidentally the year that the memorial to Charlie, the germ of the idea for this institution, if you will, was 1930. To the end of her life, Nancy's attention remained focused on elevating the public appreciation of Charles M. Russell's art legacy. From 1896 onward, that effort was at the core of her personal mission in life. She was a really admirable person. There were lots of controversy about some things she did and said, but she never was confused about her mission in life. Thank you very much.
So just as Tom mentioned, the catalog is available for pre-order down at the museum booth on the Civic Center if you'd like to do that. Thank you all for coming. I'm sorry that our presentations went a little bit longer and squeezed out our Q&A section, but we'll all be at the auction tonight, so come find us, ask us questions personally. We'll be happy to answer it. And thank you all for another wonderful symposium. We appreciate your attendance here.